And the way violence is so often used to silence art and silence any kind of voice that challenges authority, especially challenges authoritarianism, challenges conservatism. It really, not just here, but also even in the US and other countries, these kinds of voices are never not in danger. When I first came here in 2007, it was even far more dangerous, I think. The atmosphere in Pakistan, I remember being in Karachi with a band I won't mention, and I said, all right, I need to leave. I was actually going to Faraz's house from them. And I said, I'm just going to jump in a taxi. And the first words out of their mouth, there was a horror on their face. And they said, please don't take a taxi. You'll get Daniel Pearled. And everyone knows Daniel Pearl was the Wall Street Journal reporter who was kidnapped and beheaded. And to them, as a foreigner, that was the likely outcome of me getting in a taxi. Now, 12 years later, the biggest worry is Kareem or Uber. So things have improved, at least in terms of security for us. And having just come from Kabul, it really, Pakistan feels like so much more open than it was then. But that openness masks a lot of problems also. So I want to talk about them a bit today and about how the kind of balance, the difficult balance between doing art that is politically effective and politically powerful and also trying to be an artist, and also in a situation where either the political or economic powers that be will often either co-opt you or silence you as soon as you have any ability to change the narrative or change the dynamics of the situation. But I want to start with something funny, because I think the humor and the way things become satire and the way things become funny that weren't previously funny is a good way to measure whether any particular kind of art has finally crossed the barrier and become acceptable. So this first video I want to show you is from 2008. It's a video from MTV Arabia. In fact, I learned about it when I flew from here to Dubai, and I met the people who were making the video. And it's a video, as you'll see, that advertises heavy metal as a genre. And this was quite interesting because in most of the Middle East and Arab world and North Africa, heavy metal was more or less illegal. A decade earlier, in 1997, there was a series of crackdowns of satanic scares where metal artists were accused of being devil worshippers. They were arrested, they were beaten, they were threatened with prosecution in Egypt, they were threatened with death by the Grand Mufti. So this was very serious. And the metal scenes, which were actually, as many of you probably know, were certainly not insignificant from Morocco all the way to Indonesia, all across the Muslim world, were suddenly under huge threat. And in many countries, they had to go underground. So metal was not a funny thing, right? It could get you arrested, it could get you jailed, it could get you ostracized, it could even get you killed. In Iraq, several metalheads were actually killed. But all of a sudden, around 2007, something was changing. 4 years earlier, in 2003, a bunch of metalheads were arrested, 14 of them, by the Moroccan government, which had the reputation of being very moderate and modern, but in fact was quite oppressive towards metal. They were arrested and charged, as usual, with Satanism. One of the pieces of evidence was that the cop walked in who raided their house, where the metalheads were living, and found an ashtray in the shape of a star, a five-pointed star, which is, of course, can be a pentagram if you're into magic or metal. And he looked at it, and he happened to walk past it, and the pointy end first, just the way it was positioned. He said, aha, an upside-down star, a pentagram. You clearly are Satan worshippers. And boom, off to jail. Of course, what the guy was telling, no, if you just turn it a little bit this way, it's not a pentagram, it's actually the star from the Moroccan flag. We're not Satanists, we're actually supporting Morocco. Needless to say, no one wanted to hear that. So, because they had too good a story. They had a bunch of kids with a upside-down pentagram, and they were going to be examples. However, unlike Egypt, unlike Iran, unlike Lebanon, unlike almost every other country in the Middle East that had a satanic scare, in 2003 in Morocco, the kids fought back. They organized probably the first internet-driven campaign in the Arab world, youth-driven, internet-driven campaign. They had people all over Europe and the US signing petitions, putting up all kinds of support for them, that they should be freed and you can't silence music, etc. They actually staged a metal show in front of the court in Morocco. And so big was the pressure that even though they were convicted, basically the government or the king overturned the conviction. And they were freed, and metal took off. After that, with that huge victory, which was, as far as I could tell, the first youth-led victory against an authoritarian regime in the Arab world in forever. Literally. I can't think of one before that, and I'm a historian. Maybe someone else can. So this was a huge victory. Metal became huge. Within a couple years, you could go to independent metal festivals in Morocco. There'd be 100,000 people, right? So it became huge. So metal was suddenly okay. But no one thought it would be so easily monetized. And at that very moment where metal was starting to get its legs as both a political and a cultural force, MTV put this out. I'll play it for you. Turn it louder. Hold on. I don't hear any, oh, here. Can someone make the music louder? Or from here? Whatever this is? You got it? One second, sorry. It's worth the wait. How's that? Okay, good. So now we'll do it. So this is a commercial for MTV Arabia. It starts off with a typical evening in a bourgeois establishment with music in the Arab world circa 1950 or so, right? And then things go a little bit off the rails, as you kind of already saw. That was actually Faraz Anwar on guitar. No, it wasn't. No. Sounded a little bit like you. No, but so this to me was very emblematic that metal had gone from being literally something that could get you jailed to something that was now halal, right? And of course, what I had just really started understanding at the time was in Pakistan, it was quite a different situation than the Arab world. It didn't have these, even with the rise of very conservative forces, there were all these rock bands. Of course, Janoom was the epitome of it, but so many others in the 2000s. And the relationship of music was much more powerful and much harder to control. And there were what happened here before the violence in the late 2000s and other issues closed down closed down the scene in many ways, was so far ahead of what was happening in the Arab world, never mind Iran, that it really was a special place. But this kind of showed that in the Arab world, at least, people were beginning to loosen up. Now, it was roughly around that same time when I was traveling around that I also noticed that many of the activists from the metal scene were starting to become politically active. It made sense to me. Obviously, metal is inherently a subversive genre. If you listen to the great early metal bands, especially Black Sabbath, they were very anti-war. Songs like War Pigs and others. The music itself was subversive. And metal and also punk and even early hip-hop, all these genres came out of places which were poor or working class, which were suffering and going through periods of deindustrialization, changing. People were losing jobs. Young people didn't have a future. The lead guitarist of Black Sabbath, Tony Iommi, explained that, you know, the music sounded like shit because we lived in shit. If you lived in like Birmingham in the late 60s, things were really going downhill, so you weren't going to be playing happy music. You were going to be playing music that reflected that. So I thought it was quite natural. But here, all of a sudden, in places like Morocco and Egypt and Iran, well, not so much Iran, but especially Egypt and Morocco and Tunisia, metalheads were suddenly, who were now in their 20s, were going to college, were out of college, were starting to become politically active. And they were starting to take on the regime. So many of the organizations that were founded then to start pressuring their governments had people who came out of the metal scene. And it made a lot of sense because the very qualities it took to create a metal scene, right, in the Middle East and North Africa, right, in the 90s and 2000s, to be able to do something truly underground, clandestinely, to spread the word without anyone knowing, to figure out a way to create a community that can be together without arousing the suspicion of governments or conservative forces. Well, you can imagine these skills come in handy if you're suddenly trying to organize underground political movements as well. So all of a sudden, right, you saw a different impact of the metal scene. It wasn't just a cultural opening. It was also a political opening. And I'll just show you, this is a little bit of a documentary I made that we began shooting in 2008. This is the first metal show in Cairo in almost a decade. And the people who are in the band are the sons of a very famous dissident, Egyptian dissident, who was in jail at the time, named Ayman Noor.
Do you put the microphone so good up? Hey guys, as already said, I really like to thank you all for coming here tonight. And guys, we really need to say thank you to Sending Zoe.
So you could see in a place like Cairo, which was truly subversive, you could have 800 kids suddenly getting together again. Girls who are wearing hijab, you know, muhajaba, who you normally wouldn't imagine would be headbanging, never mind next to boys, next to young men. All things were suddenly really changing. There was fighting like any good metal show, people were fighting in the audience, and security services were trying to shut it down. So everything you needed to have a good scene was present then, right? But at the same time that this was happening, again, there was a struggle. There was the beginnings of a struggle for a much greater political opening in these countries, right? And metalheads were slowly in the position of taking the lead. In Iran, where there was no political opening, there no chance really to have any kind of input, what they did was create videos which were extremely subversive. This one is by a wonderful guitar player, Ali Azhar from Tehran, who had a band, Artemis. that made a song called Baptize. And this song, and he was also a filmmaker, this song represented the way, in his view, religion baptized young people into conformity and into following whatever the Islamic Republic wanted. Why it's not showing, I don't know. So even when people couldn't become politically active in the public sphere, they could do something now which was still very hard for governments to control, which was use the internet. Use this new thing called Facebook, use YouTube. All these things didn't really exist before 2004, 5, and 6, right? So these were now open, and people could put stuff on these. For example, when he wanted to put this up, the secret police burst in right before they were going to upload it and arrested them and grabbed all their copies, but one tape was already out there. Once someone uploaded it, there was nothing anyone could do. Ah, okay. Sorry. I don't know why. Okay. Sorry. So once this was uploaded, it could not be silenced, right? Even though there was a ban on YouTube, everyone knew how to get around it, just like in Iran, people still know how to get around, or anyone who's interested, get around any of the censoring of various websites. So there was this real challenge to authority. It wasn't just metal, it was also hip-hop, which wasn't really that big here yet, but was becoming increasingly important all over the Arab world, and especially in Iran. And in other countries, from Morocco to Indonesia, punk was really important, and punk rockers were also, as they were everywhere from the Sex Pistols on down, very political, using the music to challenge authority. So what had started out as a kind of small subcultures of musicians who really just wanted to be left alone to listen to metal or punk or hip-hop or whatever, gradually they were becoming countercultures. As people were getting older and realized they had nothing to lose and no future in the current system, the ethos and the skills they learned in these small scenes allowed them to pressure their governments in ways that the governments did not yet know how to counteract. So all of a sudden, these kids who were marginalized were starting to be at the center of a transformation in oppositional politics across the Middle East and North Africa, and even into what we might call Central Asia, right? Then, as most of you have probably heard and know about, on December 17th, 2010, a young Tunisian fruit seller whose fruit and his cart was taken by the police went down to the city hall in this very small, dusty town called Sidi Bouzid and demanded to have it back. When he was not given it back and told he'd have to pay a fine he could never possibly afford, he went to the gas station, bought a few liters of kerosene, went back in front of the municipality building, poured it over himself, and set himself on fire. That young man, Mohammed Bouazizi, basically sparked the Arab Spring with this. What people don't realize is that that spark, you can have a lighter and you can set up sparks, but if there's no kindling, if there's nothing there to actually catch fire, you can have 1,000 sparks, they just dissipate. So the reason that event, and he was only the third person that month to set himself on fire, so it's not like he came out of nowhere. People were already so desperate that they were killing themselves ritualistically. His just happened to be caught on a cell phone video and picture, and it spread like wildfire through young people, especially who had cell phones, and he became a symbol for an uprising that very rapidly overtook what everyone had believed to be the most stable dictatorship in Africa, perhaps, which was the Tunisian dictatorship, right? And one of the key moments in that battle was when a young singer named Emel Maflouthi, a beautiful, amazing singer, stood in front of the steps of the Opera House on Bourguiba Boulevard in Tunis and sang a song that she had written that the government would never allow to be played on the radio. but which had spread through the internet and other means, so that by the time she sang it on these steps, the entire crowd of thousands and thousands of people knew the words. Let me just play this for you. So, what's really fascinating, it's a beautiful video and beautiful song, is that Amel, who today is one of the most popular sort of alternative artists in the Arab world, always touring all over, she started off as a metalhead and was in a metal band. Her first band was singing metal, right? And she came out of the scene too, and she once told me, you know, I may sing with a beautiful voice, but inside I'm fierce, and that comes from the metal. So, you know, her roots were in this kind of powerful music, and you see this all over the place, right? About 45 days later, right, 2,000 kilometers to the east, in Cairo, another metalhead who no one had heard of. She at least was somewhat well known. She wasn't really famous yet, because the government had prevented her from gigging and such. So she wasn't that famous yet. But then in Cairo, on January 25th, another uprising erupted, which most of you have probably heard of, the 18 days of the Egyptian revolution, which toppled Mubarak, an even more stable, perhaps, dictator than Ben Ali. And it was on February 2nd that a young guy, a metalhead from the provinces, from Mansoura, a town in the Nile Delta, about 100 kilometers or so to the north. He had seen the protests begin in Cairo, was getting texts and Facebook messages from his friend, and so he grabbed the only two things that mattered to him, which were a sleeping bag and an acoustic guitar, and decided and took a service taxi to Cairo. Showed up in Cairo and just spent the first day listening to what people were chanting. Now, he was just a metalhead. He thought he might be a pop singer, but he really didn't have the voice for it, and it was kind of funny. But so that dream had failed. But he was a big fan of Slipknot and Korn and all these kinds of new metal bands. And he kind of played guitar, but not that well, but he had a good feeling. But he did have an ear, and he sat there on the first day. And then on the second day was the Battle of the Camel, the famous video I'm sure everyone's seen, where there were people on camels and horseback riding into the crowd, whipping people, and then people were fighting back. And when they actually pushed out these people, most of whom were very poor camel drivers, and they were the people who took you on the tour of the pyramids, when you'd go to the pyramids. And these people who were literally starving and facing the slaughter of their animals, because once the revolution broke out, no one had work. All the tourists ran away. So they were literally people who lived on $1 or $2 a day. Without that money, they were starting to starve. So when the Mubarak government offered them $50 or so each to go attack the protesters, that's what they did. It was a very tragic event, because they were also victims of the regime. But when they were defeated and pushed out, right, that was the day that the revolution established itself in Tahrir Square. And in the meantime, this kid came, and he just sat around, and after he was in that battle and he was injured, and he was sitting around at night in the tent city that had formed, and he just started singing this song that he'd written out of the chants that people were doing, right? But he did it in a way that reflected the anger and the rhythms and the feelings of the music he ultimately loved, which was metal. And at first, they would not let him play it in front of anyone on stage. The stages were controlled by the unions and protest groups. There were maybe 7 stages in Tahrir Square. But as he kept playing it just in the crowd, more and more people started sitting around him. And since they knew the words, they started chanting with him. And within 24 hours, it was the biggest song in the square, and they started inviting him up to sing it. And once he sang it once, everyone started coming. And within another day, it was the song of the square. And within a week, he was the singer of the revolution. And the song Erhal became perhaps the most important it was voted the second most important revolutionary song of all time. I happened to be there during these protests, so I saw this and I saw it evolve and how it went from just sitting around a campfire, literally, it wasn't a campfire, but it was cold, so it was February, people had lit fires, to suddenly having the entire square of 100,000 people singing your song. And I just want to play a little of it because I think it gives you, it gives an example of how these, let's see, let's see. Sorry. Here it is. Yeah. So here it is already maybe the third day that he's singing it, and already the entirety of Tahrir knows the song. Now this video is a video I saw the day before I left for Egypt on February 1st or so. This is not the exact version that was put up. When I first saw it, it had 300 views. By the time I got to Egypt 2 days later, it had 3,000. In another day or two, it had 30,000 views on YouTube. By the time the 18 days were over, it had hundreds of thousands. Right? So you can hear just him on an acoustic guitar. But the anger and the rhythm and the repetition, which he said came out of all those years listening to the music he loved, kind of drove this song, which sounded nothing like Egyptian music. The guy playing a kind of metal-y flamenco thing on the guitar, couldn't really sing, so he was more or less shouting, but everyone caught it, right? And this became the song of the revolution, of the Egyptian revolution, and along with Imam Mathlouth's song and this rap song in Tunisia, became the three songs that kind of symbolized it. He was, again, a metalhead who was so inspired that he became active, and he became one of the spokespeople for the revolution, right? Now, what I want to argue here is that you can really see how then you have what began as a subculture, becomes a counterculture, and ultimately became the core of a revolutionary culture that was willing, not only willing to take on a murderous regime, but had the upper hand at the moment in the struggle because it had a technological capacity and an organizational strategy that the regime couldn't get past. And in fact, many of the leaders in Tahrir were people that I met years earlier who were just metalheads. But it was literally being in this scene that had to be underground that gave them the skills to then be at the lead and the forefront of this movement, because they were the main unions and the main normal political parties or political forces. They were very closely monitored. The government could find them. They knew how to track them. They knew what they were saying. But these kids, they didn't. And that really allowed them to manage Tahrir Square in a way that the government could not get a handle on, right? So this is how an underground music helped create a revolutionary, not just a revolutionary culture, but a revolutionary practice that at least for a moment, governments could not counteract. And you see this repeated in other Arab countries as well, right? So that's the first thing that I think is very important to point out. What is interesting to me is that this dynamic, at least as far as I understand, never really existed here. There wasn't the kind, even under Musharraf, even under the dictatorship years, the military dictatorship, there was a very different dynamic here, right? There wasn't the need or the space for this kind of music to be underground in many ways because it wasn't so underground, right? It wasn't something that was so subculture that, in Iran, when you wanted to go hear a metal band, you literally had to go underground. You had to go to people's basements, right? If they lived in a big apartment building, they'd convert their storage spaces in the basement. They put all kinds of padding around it, and that's where they'd play metal. And if the Basiji, the police, the religious police heard it, they would be there. And if you didn't have enough money to pay them off, you were in trouble. Or if they were actually zealous, religious, and didn't just want a bribe, you were going to get arrested and probably get your hair cut in jail, or all kinds of beaten, or threatened. Your parents would be threatened. So it was precisely the fact that it was underground that gave it the space to create the modus operandi, if you will, the way to operate underground that helped give these scenes, at least to begin with, the upper hand against these governments, right? So that I think is one aspect that is really interesting about how in music, most people outside the region, when I would tell people 15 years ago that there were metal scenes in the Middle East, no one believed me. No one imagined there would be anyone in the Middle East would listen, or never mind, Pakistan, Iran would listen to metal, because they had the preconception of it being just religious, conservative, backwards, what have you. And how could there be metal there? How could there be hip-hop there? How could there be any kind of youth culture there, right? But now, not only was it there, it became very powerful, right? Move forward a bit, right? And a few years after, well, actually, it started before the revolution, but in Egypt especially, a new kind of music was taking shape. And this was a music that was highly political, yet not political, not politicized at all. It was a music that was born out of hip-hop, but it was hip-hop which had been big in Egypt since the mid-2000s. But it was a peculiar kind of hip-hop, right? To do, one of the things about hip-hop, and obviously in Pakistan now you have a movement like Youre Underground, and now you're starting to get a lot of hip-hop bands coming out of poor and marginal areas, right? But in Egypt and in Morocco, you had a very similar thing. But still, to do hip-hop, you needed a certain level of technical competence. Someone needed to have a decent studio. You had to know not a lot of production, certainly even less than to do rock or metal, where you needed guitars and all kinds of other stuff. But you still needed a certain level of production, and someone in the vicinity of this music had to have enough money to put together a decent studio, even if that was incredibly cheap compared to 10 years earlier. You still had to be at least at a level or have access to people who were, let's say, lower middle class or middle class. So that music developed in the Arab world and became very, very powerful by the mid to late 2000s. At the same time, another, like a subgenre of hip-hop was developing by people who were even poorer still, who did not have access to any kind of decent studios. These were people who were coming literally off the streets in the poorest areas, what in Arabic would be called the ashwiyat, the informal neighborhoods that were made, basically slum areas where there was housing which at any moment could collapse. Governments were trying to clear it out so they could create high-end properties, because often these areas were near the centers of the city. They were historically working class areas or poor areas that were being destroyed to make way for high-end developments, as goes on in every city. But this music was a music specifically that was born in these poor areas. It was sung by, or rapped, you can decide whether it was singing or rapping, by young people who really weren't even good enough to be rappers. Most of the people who were rappers, actual successful rappers, had a bit of disdain for these young rappers who didn't have much skill, who weren't really able to keep up with them. But these kids had something that even the more successful rappers in Egypt now didn't have. They had what had quickly become the sound of the streets, the sound of the weddings, the sound of the music that blasted late into the night with DJs screaming, right, over really horrible PA systems that were really very distorted. In fact, the sound, it was funny, I was in Lahore a couple days ago and it was the 9th of Muharram, so everyone was blasting, all these processions and people, sheikhs, preaching and singing, The same lousy sound systems that were equally distorted, but it's that kind of aesthetic of the really distorted sound system. So these kids were DJs. A lot of them became DJs because everyone could afford a cheap DJ system. And they would start rapping and singing over it very badly, but because it was so distorted, it didn't really matter how bad it sounded, because even if it was good, it would have sounded bad. But it was an amazing energy, and it basically became the contemporary Egyptian equivalent of rave culture, except rather than be rich, upper-class kids raving in clubs or out in the desert somewhere, these were poor kids, also a lot of them very high on all kinds of things like ketamine and things that, that poor kids would generally do. But creating a sound that was spreading like wildfire without any, unlike hip-hop, without any association to mainstream politics, not trying to change everything, just trying to represent the feeling of the streets in Egypt. Those that were left behind not just by Mubarak, but also by the revolution. And this music became mahragan music. In Arabic, mahragan means festival or party. And I'll just play you a little of it. Right? And this music, while it wasn't political, right? While it wasn't being politicized because people weren't using it to make clear demands of the government, it was highly political because they were talking about their lives as having no meaning, as being worthless, how they were completely marginalized. So they were reflecting their lives in a way that anyone familiar with early hip-hop in America, like Grandmaster Flash and The Message and these songs, would be very familiar with. But the music was also so incredibly catchy that it quickly began to take off, and suddenly it became the hottest form of music in Egypt, and also one of the hottest forms anywhere in the Arab world. And in fact, a friend of mine who works for Spotify recently told me that mahragan now is by far the biggest form of music for Arab Spotify. So it's, over the years, become really huge. Right? Let's listen to a little. So this music takes off 2013, especially 2014, right when the coup happens that destroys the democratic experiment in Egypt. And suddenly this music becomes the most powerful music there is. It's not overtly political. You can't really understand a lot of times what they're singing, which is quite interesting because that was the same issue with metal earlier, because metalheads generally sing in brutal lyrics, which no one knows what they're saying, especially if they're singing it in English. Certainly no Arab authoritarian regime is going to be able to figure out what they said. So this music was similar. But these were the kids from the most densely populated, poorest and most violent places in cities like Cairo. And this became the outlet for the frustrations of the youth who, once the coup happened, had nowhere to go and no other way of expressing themselves. And the police couldn't penetrate this. Just like this was even simpler, more simple. This was not underground in the sense that they were sending all kinds of text messages or WhatsApp in ways the government couldn't penetrate. This was out in the open, yet it was completely, so it wasn't underground, but it was underground in the sense that it was not controlled by anyone but these kids, right? And this became a huge phenomenon. And it was a way that young people were expressing their frustration in a country like Egypt when most other means of doing so overtly was completely outlawed. And these artists, these mahragan artists, went from being literally dirt poor, many of them, to having millions and millions and millions of views on YouTube and millions of downloads, and many of them started becoming rich. And as this happened, as mahragan became mainstream, as it became monetized, suddenly everything changed, right? So they went from really representing, and they'd always sung about drugs, which was really interesting in an open way, sung about women, in a very confusing way. As you could see, it's mostly a male scene. And women were almost entirely left out of it, unlike the metal scene or even the hip-hop scene, interestingly enough, because it's a working-class neighborhood where women were far more marginalized than in more middle and upper class settings. But this music, the political power of this music suddenly began to evaporate as soon as it became acceptable, mainstream. So you went from these kids who were a political source, and many of them were getting arrested. They were also, many of them were tied to different street movements, street gangs that the regime couldn't really control or penetrate. Suddenly they went from this kind of scene, once people heard them, started listening to them, to doing duets with groups like Cypress Hill, with a very different aesthetic. Right? This is Allah 50 Cent, one of the most famous of them. You can hear he's talking about hashish and weed and smoking weed. Ironically, Cypress Hill was one of the hip-hop bands in the 90s that were both incredibly political, but never outwardly political. They weren't like Public Enemy, but because they represented kind of marginalized Mexican Americans, similar to these Mahmoudane artists, they came from a very similar place. And of course, Cypress Hill, their symbol was marijuana leaf, right? So this was a marriage made in heaven. And when they did get together in Cairo, you could see what they were doing. They were smoking a lot of weed and then recording together. So this is from about a year and a half ago. So again, this is something also which I think kind of reminds me of the situation in Pakistan, where in the last 10 years you had the kind of corporatization of rock and other forms, where if you're not on Coke or Pepsi or Nescafe, it's really very difficult to sustain yourself or to get out there anymore, right? So it makes it very hard to have any kind of artistic direction or integrity, never mind integrity, certainly never mind being highly political, right? And the government doesn't have to crack down. Now the corporations can easily discipline you and silence you by not using you, not hiring you, if you in any way challenge. In the same way, these artists, which were at the forefront of a real groundswell of the poor in central Cairo and other places, going against the government, right, and forcing the government to confront its broken promises, now became more or less symbolic with just getting high, which they always were, but they were that plus something else. So as they got monetized, as they became more famous, the political aspect that was inherent in it and could have been mobilized towards an oppositional politics dropped away, right? And now they've become, many of them, fairly wealthy and fairly well known, but the social aspect of the music has been lost. And this happened also to hip-hop in Morocco, especially, where some of the artists who in the early mid-2000s were taking the lead in using music as a form of social protest against the government were bought off, literally bought off, by the king and became his biggest defenders. And there's been huge battles in the Moroccan hip-hop between those who support the king and those who oppose the king. And some of these songs get 10 or 20 million views each. So it's like the opposition and pro-royalist politics are being played out now through hip-hop videos. right? Rather than on the streets, which needless to say is exactly the way the king likes it, right? Because if you're doing this on YouTube, you're not doing it on the streets, and then the regime is safe, right? So this is the kind of struggles that are going on across the Arab world, especially also in Iran, where there's still musicians who are putting out very courageously really powerful music. Most of those that are doing so sadly had to go into exile. The last thing I want to talk about also in terms of how music gets done in, or like I said in the title of the talk, at the edge, where there's really a risk involved in using art to challenge authority, right, is that especially in Iran, but also in Egypt and other places, most of the artists who were at the forefront of this either, well, in some places they were killed. Yemen and Syria, they were killed. Egypt and Turkey now and Iran, they had to flee for their lives. Rami Assam, the young singer I told you about who had become the most famous singer in Egypt, he was basically told by the military who had already tortured him severely in the aftermath of the revolution that he had a couple of days to leave, but he had to leave very quickly or he would be killed. Right? And other artists had to leave too. So now you have a whole generation of artists who are in exile. And this raises another issue, which is whether these artists can still have any power when they're in exile. Can they still influence events back home when they're in exile? And it seems in many cases they can for a little bit, but after a while they simply can't do it anymore. Right? People just lose track of them. They don't have their finger on the pulse. People move on. And in the end, people just get annoyed at them continuing to be political from the outside when they're suffering the consequences on the inside. So Rami Assam, for example, did a video, really brutal video against the regime, but he was in Sweden, so the regime wasn't going to do anything to him. However, the people who produced the video, right, put the names of the people who made the video on it. And when it was released on someone's, I think it was someone's Facebook page, or they were able to track the person a person who was associated with the video, merely because he was the operator of the domain name it was released on. He was put in jail for several years, right? So the regime now has figured out, once you put the video up, used to be they couldn't track it. Now they have the technology to know exactly who put up the video. And if they can track anyone back to one of these kinds of videos who's still in the country, they will arrest you and you will go to jail for years. So I have friends who spent 2 years in jail. I have friends who are still in jail merely for putting up a music video that was critical of the regime. So again, what started off 7 or 8 years ago as the most important technology for staying ahead of regimes and protesting them and motivating people to protest against them, now is effectively policed by these very same regimes or the ones that took over from them. And now artists who want to be politically active are having to find new ways of using their art to be active. In Egypt, there was a huge graffiti culture. Some of the most beautiful graffiti you've ever seen was done on the walls around Cairo, central Cairo, against the Mubarak regime, against the Morsi regime that took over, against the Sisi regime. But at a certain point, the government basically started arresting, torturing, and even killing those who made the graffiti, and then just whitewashed all of it. And with that, the visual history of the revolution was whitewashed by the regime. So now it's a whole different ballgame, where the regimes, thanks to technology companies that have become so embedded with these governments, like the Saudis, like the Egyptians, like the Israelis, right, that they will provide these governments with any information they need to track people, right? Now these forms of technology are no longer safe. So the question becomes, how will the new generation that is still fighting in almost everywhere except Tunisia, which is still a more or less democratic society, what kind of technologies will they be able to deploy that at least for a moment governments can't abuse, can't track, can't follow, so that they might, when the time for protest comes around again, at least for a moment, have that crucial space to develop, to move from being subculture to counterculture to revolutionary culture, to motivate people onto the streets, right? And in all these cases, with Rami Assam, right, when his video went up, the regime was telling people, don't go to Tahrir. It's filled with criminals. People are doing horrible things there. Don't go there, you'll be attacked. But when people saw 100,000 people just chanting like that, they said, well, wait a second. Maybe I should go to Tahrir. Maybe it's okay, right? In Tunisia the month before, when a young rapper named El General was arrested and disappeared after he put up a video called Rais Lebled, the president of the country, which was a powerful indictment of President Ben Ali. When he got arrested, his video was up, and the number of views skyrocketed, and so big was the protest. That was one of the reasons why young people went out on the streets and protested. So his arrest for this song helped put people on the streets, and that helped create the momentum that silenced, that toppled Ben Ali, right? And you could talk about the same thing in Yemen. You could talk about the same thing in Palestine. You could talk about the same thing even more recently in Algeria, right? And in the Sudan. But still, governments today, once they hone in on who becomes the faces of the revolution, it's harder than ever to do that now and remain safe. So this leads to the question that I'm trying to understand, which is how can artists use technology, right? How can artists use technology today to help politically active artists, to help raise awareness and motivate people when the time is right to the streets, or help join people together to form movements that could actually have enough mass participation to challenge these authoritarian governments, when the governments now much more easily can control people's activities and monitor people's activities on the very social media that 8 years ago toppled many of the previous regimes, right? Now, that isn't necessarily a question here, right? Pakistan is a very interesting space. It is more or less democratic compared to most of the countries in the Arab world, and certainly Iran. Right? Music, even though the Taliban and conservative religious forces have long, often violently, come out against music, there's been an incredibly vibrant musical culture. Just watch Coke or Pepsi, whatever you think of them. Their dominance of the television sphere, I think, shows how impossible it would ever be to silence music here in Pakistan, thank God, right? Given how beautiful that music is. But on the other hand, because it's ubiquitous and because it's been so effectively corporatized, right, how easily it can actually be a force for change is very different. The equation becomes very different than in a place like Egypt or Morocco or Tunis or Iran, where because it wasn't being monetized, right, and it hadn't been co-opted yet, it could still be at the forefront of any kind of push for change. So it turns out in the end that the biggest threat to artists and to the role of art as a vehicle for political change isn't necessarily the governments, isn't necessarily being tortured or killed or exiled, although that's true, that also plays. It's also being bought and being co-opted and having corporations do the work of governments, right? Because now, if you want to be political, are you going to get downloads? Are you going to get that next corporate gig? Are you going to get on whatever the TV show is you need to be on when your next single comes out? Are you going to be able to monetize your music and make a living if you're also political? From what I've heard here, that's not so easy to do. It's the same in Africa too, where you have all these semi-democratic countries where, again, in similar ways, musicians, if they become too political, for example, like in Nigeria, they'll just never get a corporate gig again. They'll never get downloads again. They'll never be on the phone. In many African countries, when you call someone, you hear a song before it connects to them, and then it says you can download this for whatever, 20 cents of credit. That's a lot. You know, if you have 200 million people, that's a lot of downloads you can get. But needless to say, if you're criticizing the government, you're not going to be given those opportunities. You're not going to be invited to the big shows. You're not going to be put on national television, right? And so whether it's governments stopping you or corporations stopping you, it still leaves very little room for musicians to both be political and make a living doing their art, right? The last thing I want to talk about very quickly is just a whole other level of art at the edge. I just came here from Kabul a couple of weeks ago, and I was working with an amazing artist that Arif knows, Lanny Cordola, an American musician, who went to Kabul. He had played with some of the greatest artists on earth. He actually worked with Atif Aslam, some of you might have heard of. And if any of you have ever seen a video of Atif Aslam playing with Guns N' Roses, if any of you are Atif Aslam fans, that's okay. I won't hold it against you. If you ever watched that video of him with Guns N' Roses, that was Lanny who arranged it and who was playing on it. But he got so tired of the rock and roll life, for reasons I still don't understand, that he came here first, actually, and was traveling around Pakistan working with young people. And then he went to Kabul and he met a young girl named Mursal, whose two sisters had been blown up in a suicide bombing about a year or so before he met them. And he so fell in love with these young girls, they were only 8 or 9 years old at the time, that he moved to Pakistan and set up a school to teach young girls and boys who were very poor and who had suffered from the horrible war in Afghanistan. More or less, their parents or their siblings had been killed by suicide bombings or by the Americans. You know, take your pick, whether it's a bomb on the ground or a bomb coming from a drone or in the air. So many people have lost family members in Afghanistan, right? And he created a school called the Miraculous Love Kids, right? Which his only goal, not political at all, was to basically provide a space where traumatized children from war could come and learn guitar. That's it, right? And of course, in Afghanistan, where the Taliban have much more power and where any form of music is really, again, as we all know, Afghanistan has an absolutely incredible musical tradition. No one would have ever thought of this 40 years ago, but after the Soviet invasion and the Taliban and all of that, music is a very contentious, if it's not a nasheed or something, contentious subject. So to have these young girls coming together to learn guitar, never mind from a Western guy, in a school was a hugely political act, in fact, even though politics had nothing to do with it. And having spent a week with these amazing young people and seeing how just the act of mostly young girls coming together, learning to sing and play guitar, singing their own songs in Dari, as well as learning rock and roll songs that most of you know, is itself an act of extreme politics that fundamentally challenged every single side in Afghanistan. It certainly challenged the Taliban. It certainly challenged the Americans. It challenged the Afghan government. It challenged the corruption of the police, right? It challenged every force of violence. And these girls have now become something of a symbol of the resilience and the hope of young people in Afghanistan, even against the ongoing horrific power of war and violence. So let me just show you just the video, one of the videos. And just so you can get an idea of. Oh, sorry. So this is these amazing, yeah. And so I've been talking so far about politics, but this is not directly politics, right? This is This is politics in a much more powerful way than politics can ever do. Let me just try to find the main video for it. Media. Here we go. Home. Here you can see a little. So you can see, I can't find the video right now, but you can see from just the videos how they have become quite powerful symbol of the resilience of young people, right? And how just music, even if it's not trying to do anything else, right, can become an extremely powerful force against all forms of hatred and oppression and hatred and oppression and corruption and violence. So even without the politics, right, music remains, and especially music in this kind of situation, in a situation of such desperation, in a situation with so little hope, right, it becomes still one of the few forces that can bring people together, that can open people's minds. When you see all these young girls, and they're all from traditional families, as you can see, right? And their families get so involved, and their mothers and their fathers are coming, and their brothers are coming, and they're creating a new community that is able to support each other. Some of these kids' families, since it started, have been killed. Some of the kids have been kidnapped and killed who were part of this, right? And yet the bonds they formed are some of the only thing that's keeping their communities from falling apart, especially now that, you know, while I was there were bombings every day. Now there's 5 bombings a day because the peace process has fallen apart. So this, to me, is just a great example of, even in a situation where normal politics or any kind of politics really is irrelevant, right? This kind of art at the edge of literally chaos and violence and mass murder can be a light that literally gives these kids and gives anyone who spends any time with them hope for a better, you know, a better future. So I'll stop there and take any questions you might have. Thank you. Sure.
How do you compare the situation? You said it's not, you know, it's not censorship by the government or by the regime. It's the corporatization of music. So the same thing has happened in the USA also.
Absolutely.
I mean, is it the same? How much parallels do you draw? How is it different?
Well, I mean, it is.
When rap came into being, it was the music of resistance, and then it became
corporatized, and then it went out the window. Absolutely. This is, you know, it happened with hip-hop before. When there was a country group, the Dixie Chicks, who challenged George Bush after he invaded Iraq, and they publicly said they didn't agree with his position. They were completely ostracized and their careers almost destroyed, because country music stations, and of course country music is generally very conservative, so they basically blackballed them, they blacklisted them. So this happens all over the world. And what I think this points to, of course, is it shows you how under globalization you have a kind of, in a way, a flattening out of how politics works in so-called democracies, but ones where corporations are really what are running the show. That doesn't really happen in Sweden, right? It doesn't happen in Scandinavia. It won't happen in Germany so much. It won't happen in a lot of places where you don't have such a corporate-ruled political economy. In the US, you do. In places like Nigeria or in Africa, we have highly corrupt regimes where not even necessarily corporations, but just corrupt elites who control large sectors of the economy, often tied to the state, right? Especially economies, oil economies, where the corruption is just even higher, right? In these situations, again, it's very easy for them to control the media. It's very easy for them to use the media to control people. You know, the thing about the U.S., differences in the U.S., there was until recently enough of an indie scene, enough of an independent scene where artists could still make some money selling their music themselves and going out on the road a bit and could make a living. That's, in one hand, much easier now with things like Spotify, but because the rate of return is so low, it's actually much harder. So you used to be able to go on tour, sell your CDs, sell your t-shirts. You could make enough of a living to continue doing this music. But when everything now is Spotify, when no one's buying CDs, and you earn, you know, a tenth of a cent on a download, and you may get 100,000 downloads, is a lot of downloads, but it turns into like $10, maybe $100. But what does that mean if you're a four-piece band, right? That your big hit made $100 on Spotify. And that's it, because no one buys it anymore. No one goes to iTunes. Apple's closing iTunes because no one even pays to download songs. Everyone just streams it. I don't pay to download songs. For $10, you can have Spotify and never pay a dime again. And I'm a musician, but what are you going to do at a certain point? It's just too amazing to have these services. So again, the balance of power between artists and corporations has so shifted again towards the corporation. And the only artists who you think, like Beyonce, everyone knows who Beyonce is, who you think, oh, she's a symbol of liberalism and progressivism. No, she's not. She's a corporate hack. Her husband just signed a multi-gazillion-dollar deal with the National Football League, the most racist bunch of plantation owners in the history of humanity, and now he's representing them. So how can that in any way represent a progressive politics is beyond me. But so in the end, even the so-called heroes are completely sold out, right? It used to be that a band like Rage Against the Machine, all of you have heard of Rage Against the Machine, right? I remember the lead singer, Zach De La Rocha, got a lot of flack because some fans saw him coming out of a Nike store and getting into his BMW. Like, wait a minute, here's Zach De La Rocha. Why are you buying Nikes and driving a BMW? You should be wearing like some handmade, you know, sneakers from the Pueblo in Mexico and driving, I don't know, a beat-up Volkswagen or at least a Prius or something. You know, so people started to realize even the you know, the bands that were the symbol of this kind of oppositional politics eventually sold out, right? I think what happened now among activists is that they realize there's no heroes. You know, they can't rely on anyone but themselves. So what's interesting there is that the need for big artists as a galvanizing force no longer is as important. So it's gone back to like the folk tradition, you know, where you just sit around create. So music is still important, art, but you don't need to know. Everyone realizes the big artists are too co-opted. The very fact that they're that big means they're co-opted. And therefore, it's just not as important. So people sort of matured out of the need for artists to motivate them. And now the artists try to tag along once they think that this is enough of a trend that they could sell some of their music, you know, except for a few that are coming out of it. So it's, you know, that's, I think, what happened there. I don't know what I think it might be maybe something similar here. The reality is that most artists just can't make a living anymore playing art. It's not something you do to make a living. Even if you're an amazing artist, even if you have a lot of support, even if you're celebrated and win awards and such, you're still almost impossible to make a decent living doing it. And you have to hustle and do a million other things to survive. But of course, that's the way artists have always been. So it's just kind of returning art to, you know, you have the few favorites of the king or the court, like in the old days, and everyone else just does art because it's art and that's what they're compelled to do. So I see that in the US. I see that, you know, in Africa and other places. The only way to defeat that kind of corporatization is to stop trying to monetize art and to do it because that's what's inside of you and that's what needs to be done. That's how you serve, you know, people, the rest of humanity. So that's in a way the victory is giving up, right? As long as people are trying to figure out how can I monetize and still be political, you've lost. because you can't, in any meaningful sense. You simply can't. Maybe 1 out of 1,000 artists get lucky. But usually once they get lucky, they get bought off. Once they get big, that they actually are big, then the corporations show up and they sink their teeth in you. I'll just give you a great example. Oh my God, the rapper, probably the most important rapper on the planet right now. Who am I thinking of? Kendrick Lamar. Anyone heard of Kendrick Lamar? 1 million Grammys, most famous political rapper in the world, for sure. But, once he got famous, all the activists that he was working with, suddenly there were layers of people who they could just call him all the time. Suddenly no one had his number. If you wanted to reach him, you had to go through his manager. Forget it. First question is how much and how many zeros. If it wasn't at least 6 zeros, he's going to hang up on you. And you can't even get past the bubble anymore to get to him in any meaningful way. So that's just the reality. Once the artists get that big, they're no longer relevant to any kind of serious movement for social change, with a very few, Roger Waters, okay. He's from the old days, and he's Pink Floyd, and he can do whatever the hell he wants. But, there's maybe Roger Waters and Brian Eno and 4 or 5 others, and that's more or less it, right, on the planet. So that's the reality, So, like, maybe in a way it just takes the pressure off music to try to save things through widespread fame, and instead brings music back to, music's there to move people in communities, not to be plastered on billboards. So I think that's the dynamic, but it is the same force. Well, alcohol. And I don't say that because I'm advocating anyone drink. I'm saying it because when you don't have places that when places can't serve alcohol, which is how anyone makes money, then they can't afford bands. I like to think it wasn't Muhammad, but whoever the early jurists who decided alcohol should be haram, if they did, debate over that, and more actually people now think maybe that's not necessarily the only reading. But when that became the mainstream interpretation, I don't think anyone knew 1,400 years ago she was going to doom music scenes all across the Muslim world. But in a way, it's just huge. If venues can't make money, they're not going to have they're not going to bring in bands, and it's very hard to have a live scene. I mean, in the U.S., of course, no one makes money playing live unless you are at a certain level. So you're not making money. But if at least there's a place that can make money having you, there'll at least be a place you can play and build a crowd. If there's nowhere to have you, if people can't make enough money, and again, we're not talking like this is a beautiful space to have an acoustic night, right? I'm sure you've had plenty of those, and it's amazing, and people will come, and it's great. We're talking, rock music or hip-hop or things that require live instruments and PA systems and a much bigger kind of system that you really need a club kind of environment for. Without alcohol, that's more or less impossible, right? So sadly, I think the biggest thing missing is alcohol. Without alcohol, without a way to make money, without a way for venues to make money off of people coming to hear live music, how is it that there are spaces that have the ability to promote this kind of live music? I don't know. Faraz, you've been doing this a long time. I'm sure you've tried every possible, right? It's very difficult to do this. You can't keep doing people's houses. You can't keep doing, renting out venues because people aren't going to just come over and over, without other means of without other reasons to be there. It's just very hard. So what happened in Morocco is really interesting because Morocco, you can get alcohol a lot easier, but it's still not at all prevalent the way it is in Egypt, for example, where most every club in Cairo will have alcohol, and beer at least. In Morocco, there's still a lot of places where they just don't serve alcohol. Especially in not in Tangier, less so, but in other places, it's still hard to get a drink in a lot of places. So they've had to form different kinds of venues. They've had to form sort of basically NGOs for music, which would get government money. This is the thing, right? So there's a place in Morocco. When I talked about the metal scene, and there was this festival that got 100,000 people, actually 150,000. It's huge, the biggest independent festival in Africa, right? But they wanted to build a space for young people to come where they could have rehearsal space. There was no rehearsal space in Morocco for bands. They wanted a place where people could play together and actually do gigs, and everyone would know, here's where you can do gigs, right? But this cost tens and tens of thousands of dollars, right? Just putting on the independent festival alone, the first few years, when it got huge, they had minimal sponsorship, Nokia and a few other things. And once it got too big, well, once you're having these giant cranes with cameras and huge screens, you know, because that's how big you've grown. You have 100,000 people. Most of the people can't even see the stage. You suddenly need giant screens. Suddenly it's $100, $200, $300, $400,000 to put on a festival, right? When you have the stage like that. And it's free, so you're not making money. What happens? You need sponsors. Once you need sponsors, how do you remain political? And this festival, one of the two founders, they at one point they decided to take on big corporate sponsorship. They did it for a couple years. They got so disgusted with themselves, they got rid of it. What happened the year they got rid of it? The founder was so stressed he had a heart attack 2 weeks before the festival. So, well, that's not doing you any good if trying to do a festival of DIY, do it yourself, kills you. That's kind of defeating the purpose of having an independent music festival, right? So they created an NGO to do this, where a place kind of like this, bigger though, they have rehearsal studio, recording studios, a radio studio, all kinds of things that they could use to train young musicians. Okay, who you think gave them money? The king wrote the check. Well, now you've taken money from the king. So, do you think this festival is suddenly going to have people, acts who are very critical of the king? Certainly not. So, what do you do? And I've talked to them about it, and they're very torn. They're like, well, we don't want to take money, right, from the king. We don't want to. We know what that means. But on the other hand, the limited effect of having political artists, to the extent there were still political artists who were not in exile in Morocco, play, compared to having a space, you know, one day a year, compared to having a space that every day can have people in, rehearsing, doing gigs, learning how to engineer, learning how to do radio. There was no comparison. It actually was much more important to have a space to train the next generation than it was to have a festival that was completely independent of the government. And anyway, the founders would be dead by now from exhaustion. So, you know, these are the compromises people have to make. In Morocco, you know, I don't know if it's the same thing here, but that was, you know, and again, it was the king, who's one of the richest men on earth, in his private capacity, who wrote a check for $100,000. So it wasn't even the government, he just handed over a check to them. And that's a different story, of course. I don't know that there's any kings around Pakistan who are going to write I don't know if Imran Khan's going to write a $100,000 check for a nice rehearsal and recording and music facility. It'd be very nice, though. But if he did, probably the advice would be take it, right? Take it and use it and build for the future, rather than having your integrity and you know, not having anywhere to play. Having integrity isn't really worth it if you have nowhere to have integrity, right? Except your bedroom or your friend's, you know, garage or something. So that's the kind of dynamic that everyone's fighting everywhere. That's the same everywhere now. I will say, if anyone's interested in the book, you can find the book for free. I'm trying to sell it as 10 years old online. Heavy Metal Islam was the book that he mentioned, or I can send it to you. And the new edition will be out sometime next year. The new volume, volume 2. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.